A little-known armored car design, the Automitrailleuse CDM, or CDM Armored Car, is one of the most extensive armored vehicle projects undertaken in secrecy, not only from the general public, but also from the higher-ups of the manufacturer's own military. This was a project undertaken by a rogue element of the Vichy Regime's military that refused to accept the Armistice and prepared to resist a German invasion of the unoccupied southern half of France. The CDM armored car's production was in full swing by the point the invasion of the Vichy Free Zone in November of 1942 put a definitive halt to the secret armament project. Welcome to a new Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. We are happy to announce that the 4th issue of the Tank Encyclopedia magazine is out. You can find it on PayHip or on Amazon, and it contains articles about the B-1 Centauro, the Lorraine 37L, a plane article, and even modeling techniques. So go ahead and check it out. It's only $5. France's swift defeat at the hands of the Wehrmacht in May-June 1940 brought down upon the country a harsh armistice, not entirely incomparable to the one Germany was subjected to at the conclusion of the First World War. The French army's size was reduced to a mere 100,000 men, at least in mainland France, with its armored component reduced to 64 Panhard 178 cars, vastly weakened by the removal of their 25mm SA-35 anti-tank gun, and studies of armored vehicle designs were prohibited. Many within the reduced army of the new Vichy Regime, as it came to be called, were far from pleased with the conditions of this armistice. Overwhelmingly composed of personnel already in service in 1940, the army did not see with a good eye the occupation of France's northern half and the vast reduction of its capacities. As early as July of 1940, a French colonel, Émile Mollade, created a secret service within the army of the new regime. The Camouflage du Matériel, equipment camouflage, shortened to CDM. The CDM was originally intended to stockpile as much armament as possible, often instead of surrendering it to the German Armistice Commission. Its goal was to be able to raise the French army from 100,000 to 300,000 men in just a few days, which was hoped to be enough to delay the German forces until reinforcements from the Western Allies and the colonies arrived in France. Through late 1940 and 1941, the service stockpiled tens of thousands of rifles and machine guns, and dozens of field artillery, anti-tank, and anti-aircraft guns. In the spring of 1941, Mollade sought to expand the CDM's mission, and entered in contact with engineer Joseph Restany, with the goal of producing 45 turrets for turretless Panhard 178 hulls that the CDM was in possession of. This prospect was successful, leading to the Panhard 178 CDM Armored Car. In early June of 1941, while the production of those turrets was still in its early phases, Mollade made another request for an armored vehicle to Restany and the armored vehicles production service he was setting up. In early June of 1941, Émile Mollade and Joseph Restany, along with a number of officers involved in the CDM, met in a conference in the town of Saint-Cyprien in Dordogne, where Restany was setting up a new workshop for the production of the CDM Panhard 178 turrets. Mollade informed Restany that the CDM had, within its reserve, 225 chassis of four-wheel drive GMC trucks, the exact model of which sadly is not specified or known, and, upon presenting one to Restany, asked if the production of an armored car based on this chassis could be possible. Upon Restany's affirmation that it could, Mollade placed some additional but still fairly vague requirements, requesting an armament that could be as heavy as possible, a fully rotating turret, and a rear driving post which would improve the vehicle's mobility. He then requested Restany and his workshops to get to work on this new project as soon as possible. In July and August of 1941, while the CDM turrets for the Panhard 178 were yet to be assembled, Restany set up a design bureau as well as a workshop working on the chassis in Saint-Cyprien. At the same time as the overall vehicle's design was being created, modifications were done to the chassis in order to make them more suitable to base armored cars on. These were quite extensive. The rear was shortened by 1.1 meters and the front by 20 centimeters. The rear wheels were brought forward by about 1.10 meters to reduce the wheelbase. The frontal radiator was lowered, as well as the ventilator. Modifications were made on the direction, brake controls, the original carburetor was replaced by a smaller one, and the traction hook was moved, among others. Most of the designing work done by Restany and his team was performed in the summer of 1941. The vehicle they came up with had a mostly rectangular armored body, with a visible radiator and two headlights at the front, typical of armored cars manufactured on truck chassis. The whole had a door on each side and two frontal hatches that could be opened for better vision or closed in combat. The two front wheels had no cover, while the upper half of the rear wheels was covered. The vehicle had a rear driving post which made it easier for the armored car to leave a position if located by enemy forces. Though the speed of the vehicle in reverse or going forward was unknown. Details on the engine are scarce, but it appears to have had a 75 horsepower one. The vehicle had a fully rotating hexagonal turret, quite similar in shape to the pre-Armistice APX-3 mounted on the Panhard 178s. This turret had a top hatch and a rear door, and two viewports on the side. A number of different armaments were to be mounted in this turret, with 3 different configurations being planned. The production process of such a vehicle, especially in a context of high secrecy, required a number of different workshops which were all overseen by Restany. In July of 1941, Restany ordered a workshop set up in Saint-Genis, in Dordogne. This workshop was located on the road to Sarlat, a town where he was setting up the most extensive part of his production efforts. The objective of this workshop was to receive the original GMC truck chassis and apply the modifications Restany and his team devised to these. The workshop was set up from the 15th of August to the 15th of October 1941. It immediately began modifying the chassis it received. By May 1942, all 225 had been transformed. Restany lauded the production rates of the workshop, which produced 1.1 modified chassis a day during most of its operation, and up to 1.8 towards the end. However, he found the workshop to be a considerable risk. While some CDM commanders delivered the chassis stripped bare of anything necessary, as Restany preferred, some delivered trucks which still had drivers' cabins and bodies. This not only made the production a little more complicated but, most importantly, created a significant quantity of waste, which took a considerable amount of storage space and which Restany feared could be discovered and compromise the whole operation, especially as the Saint-Genis workshop was located near a road. As soon as the last chassis was finished, the workshop was dismantled. 2 of the 3 buildings used, which already existed prior to the CDM's installation, were kept. The third one, which had been constructed for the operation, was entirely dismantled, with the materials all being transported to Sarlat, where they were used to build a garage for the operations there. As for the chassis, they were kept in a number of farms around Sarlat. Sarlat, officially known as Sarlat-le-Canada, was the town which became the center of Restany's operations. The mayor of Sarlat, which Restany noted was sympathetic to his work, lended to the CDM a former tramway depot at basically nominal fee. In this depot, Restany organized a workshop dedicated to the production of mechanical pieces necessary for the CDM Armoured Car, most notably pieces needed for the turret race. Finding adequate industrial machines was the hardest part of setting up this workshop. While on the orders of Malad, local branches of the CDM were to provide machines to Restany's operations, some did not follow the orders, while others did it very reluctantly. The Roanne workshop, also known as ARL, provided very old machinery which had not been put to use in a long time. Restany reported that, within what they provided, was a shaper dated from 1867. Not all workshops provided such a lackluster aid though. Restany praised the Manufacture Armes de Toul, a major pre-war firearms producer which produced some of the most complicated pieces for Restany's operation, and also provided some raw materials allegedly taken from stocks used to produce 25mm SA-34 anti-tank guns for Romania, an order imposed by Germany to the factory. To complete those very deliveries of machines and pieces, Restany also manufactured machinery from private industry. The Salat workshop began operations on 15th January 1942. Orders for mechanical pieces that could not be identified as of military use were also placed with civilian manufacturers, which were in no way informed of the actual use of the pieces they were producing. A bureau was also installed in La Caneda, a rural suburb of Salat. A key part of Restany's operation was finding the armor plates necessary for the production of the hulls and turrets. The CDM Armoured Car used plates of 4 different thicknesses: 5, 10, 15, and 20mm. Restany wanted his armor to be military standard steel, made under the same conditions and with the same quality as the armor of French military vehicles produced before the Armistice. Finding enough armor for 225 armored cars while avoiding discovery was a complicated process, in which Restany and the CDM had to acquire steel from a variety of different providers. 3 different steelworks provided steel for the CDM: Saint-Étienne, Saint-Chamond, also known as FAMH, an important artillery and tank manufacturer prior to the Armistice, and Eugene. Getting those facilities back to work was a complicated affair, as the production of military-grade steel had been stopped since the Armistice. The CDM had to deliver 856 tons of coal to the steelworks through the months of March, April, and May of 1942 in order to get steel production back on track. Molded steel was provided from the steelworks of Sault-du-Tarn. In order to get those back in operation, the CDM had to provide them with particularly hard-to-find chromium and nickel, an operation which was executed under the management of Mollard. An additional quantity of steel came from an unexpected source: the French Société Nationale de Chemin de Fer, the National Railways Company. In possession of an armored train, the company removed its armored plates and delivered those to the CDM. By June of 1942, 670 tons of military-grade steel had been moved to the storage facilities of the CDM in the steelworks of the large city of Toulouse. More details are available on the composition of those 670 tons. These were 155 tons of 5mm thick plates, 297 tons of 10mm thick plates, 98 tons of 15mm thick plates, and 120 tons of 20mm thick plates. The assembly of the armored car's body was carried out at the workshop of Vitrac, which was installed in a well-camouflaged cave. Another workshop was installed in the town Sousserac, in Lot, where a large unused industrial building was located. The Sousserac workshop was tasked with the final assembly of the armored cars, mating the hulls, chassis, and turrets together. In case this workshop would prove insufficient, another assembly workshop was created in Calviac, Dordogne, but it was to only operate as a depot unless needed. Sousserac's workshop first work was producing external elements that were to be placed on the hull of the vehicle: wheel casings, skirts, hatches, etc. The body of the vehicle had an armor scheme using 5, 10, 15, and 20mm plates. The front of the superstructure and driving post used 20mm plates. The rear used 15 and 20mm plates. The sides of the vehicle from the engine to the rear used 10mm plates. The front of the engine used 15mm plates, while the bottom of the vehicle and the mudguards used 5mm plates. With a driver and a rear driver / machine gun operator in the hull, and the commander / gunner / loader in the turret. The vehicle had 3 fuel tanks. While the range it had is unknown, the vehicle could move for 8 hours with the fuel it had. The vehicle's mobility is pretty much entirely unknown. It had a width of 2.23 meters, a height of 2.545 meters, and a length of 4.6 meters. Assembly of the turrets was organized in the workshop of Saint-Cyprien, where the production of the Panhard 178 CDM turrets began in the autumn of 1941. Griffoul, a quarry that had been modified into a workshop and depot for the production of those Panhard 178 turrets, retained this role for the turrets of the CDM Armoured Car. The CDM Armoured Car had a turret of hexagonal shape. The front of the turret was given 20mm of armor, its sides and rear 15mm, and its roof and turret ring 10mm. A variety of different armaments were to be mounted on the turrets. 60 vehicles were to be armed with the 25mm RF, or Région Fortifiée, a shortened fortification model of the 25mm SA-34 anti-tank guns, and 2 7.5mm MAC-31 machine guns mounted under the main gun. This configuration was inherited from the original fortification mount of the 25mm RF, which was coupled with those 2 machine guns. 150 armored cars were to be armed with a heavy machine gun, which Restany refers to as a 13.6, but most likely was a Hotchkiss 13.2mm, as well as a coaxial 7.5mm MAC-31 machine gun. Finally, 15 vehicles were to be armed with a 25mm gun, presumably a 25mm SA-35 or SA-34, as well as a coaxial 7.5mm machine gun. In all cases, an additional 7.5mm machine gun would be carried within the hull, which could be fired from the hull either at the front or at the rear. Ammunition for vehicles using the first armament type were 20 7.5mm magazines, with each magazine having 150 rounds, and 125mm shells. The exact ammunition count of the 2 other types of armament is not specified in detail, but Restany notes that it is the same weight of ammunition. 7.5mm magazines were located in axles welded in the turret, while the 25mm shells were located within ad hoc ammunition lockers. The first completed vehicle was ready by October of 1942, the assembly having been done in the workshop of Saint-Cyprien, though it was to be conducted as sous for future vehicles. The prototype was identical to the serial standard expected with the CDM Armoured Car, and had a full weapon complement. The vehicle moved on its own power from Saint-Cyprien to the park of the Marquet Castle, 20 kilometers from the workshop where the trials were to be conducted. The convoy from the workshop to the park, which included not only the armored car but several other vehicles transporting personnel and prepared to potentially repair or tow the armored car if it broke down, moved on the night of 16th to 17th October. The local gendarmerie based in Salat, which collaborated with Restany, assured the path taken by the convoy was barred from other vehicles and safe. Trials were performed in the park on 17th October. Restany reported that the vehicle drove well in mediocre pathways and cross-country and was infinitely more flexible and maneuverable than the original GMC truck. The crew was satisfied with the vehicle's handling, with the driver having very satisfactory vision and decent internal comfort and space. While some minor issues that could be fixed were found, Restany was very satisfied with the trials and decided the vehicle was ready to be presented to Mollade. The prototype returned from Marquet to Saint-Cyprien on the night of 17th to 18th October. At an unspecified date later in October, it was presented to Mollade in Marquet. The colonel had no objection to the design, and the vehicle was then moved again to Saint-Cyprien. It was then supposed to be moved to Sous-Serac to serve as a model for the assembly of the following 224 vehicles. At the end of October of 1942, with the trials producing satisfactory results, production of the CDM armored car was about to enter full swing. A considerable number of parts had already been completed. By that point, all the chassis had long been converted to the required length and been subjected to the required modifications. 15 entire armored bodies were ready. Internal structures for 150 armored vehicles, 100 armored shutters for the radiator, 200 turret races, and 250 doors were also complete. As for turrets, 65 had been completed and armed. 15 more were assembled and in the process of being armed. Restany's operation was going smoothly, with the assembly of completed vehicles in the near future starting to be a realistic consideration. Restany, his team, and Mollad had successfully set up an extensive, secretive armored vehicle manufacturing structure away from the eyes of both the collaborative higher authorities of the Vichy Regime and the German Armistice Commission. Sadly for them, though, their project would not bear its fruit due to geopolitical events far beyond their reach. A first worrying event came on 29th October, when the German Armistice Commission from Toulouse made a visit to Salat. Thankfully for Restany, he had been informed of this visit about a week prior. All the machinery of the Salat workshop was urgently evacuated to two newly created workshops about 30 kilometers from there. The Saint-Cyprien workshop was displaced from a building to the nearby woods. A warehouse in Salat, the bureau in La Caneda, and the Vitrac and Griffoul workshops were closed. The local commander of the gendarmerie, Captain Rochaud, who had organized the escort of the prototype a few days earlier, led the commission into a tobacco warehouse that had been recently constructed, opposite to the CDM workshop. Restany's operation remained undiscovered by the Germans, but he feared they may have a lead. In the following days, while the transport of all the equipment and machinery that had been evacuated back into the workshop was taking place, extremely worrying rumors of a German invasion of the Free Zone, the unoccupied part of France Restany's operation was located in, started spreading. On high alert, Restany prepared for the worst according to the recommendations of the CDM in case of an occupation of the Free Zone. On 8th November, British and American forces landed in French North Africa, arguably the most important French colony, and one which had remained loyal to the Vichy regime. Restany ordered the hulls that had been produced to be placed in wooden crates and prepared to be buried if needed. All the hulls had been placed in the crates by the 10th of November. By the evening of 10th November, Restany received the confirmation that the worst he was fearing and preparing for was coming. The Wehrmacht would come kicking in the Free Zone on 11th November. Unwilling to destroy all of his work and thinking his men would refuse as well, Restany prepared secret instructions which were issued to each workshop and only to be opened after a telephone call gave the order to do so. By 4 a.m. on 11th November, liaison personnel were delivering the envelopes around the workshops, all located in proximity to Salat. Restany's orders were to preserve as much of the technical documentation and productions as possible, while at the same time keeping his personnel as safe as possible. Administrative archives were to be destroyed, but the plans were to be kept and hidden. Parts which could easily be identified as of military use were to be buried. The turrets and weapons in particular were to be potentially recoverable if a situation in which this could be done appeared. The weapons were placed in crates and buried in fields, and the turrets were walled in the quarry-turned-workshop of Griffoul. The prototype was disassembled. Meanwhile, in the whole of the Free Zone, the French army remained in its barracks at the orders of Prime Minister Pierre Laval, and the CDM's caches were unused. In a single day, the entire Free Zone of France disappeared, with the exception of the harbor of Toulon, where most of Vichy's fleet was located and which was only occupied on 27th November, with the French fleet scuttling to avoid capture. The telephonic signal to open the envelopes was given by Restany between 9:30 a.m. and 10 a.m. on 11th November. At 11 a.m. he left Salat for Castres, where the operations began back in the spring of 1941, and many of the administrative functions remained. There he got hold of the plans and met with Mollard, who congratulated him on the measures he had taken to conserve the weapons. From Castres, Restany then moved to another town in Dordogne, Saint-Cyr, where he was to continue managing the dissimulation and destruction operations as much as possible while remaining hidden. However, in Salat, an extraordinary German commission was put in place, tasked with the investigation of a large armored vehicle manufacturing scheme German forces had stumbled upon when occupying the town. While residing in Saint-Cyr, Restany still regularly went to Salat and Castres to oversee the liquidation of the screen company that had been set in place to hide his operations. Fearing he may easily be found out due to his regular displacements in the small town of Saint-Cyr, he left for the larger Albi in April of 1943. Restany survived until the liberation unscathed. He kept writing to Mollard until September of 1943, when he and his son were found out and soon sent to a concentration camp. 3 former workers of the Salat workshop were shot in 1944, though it is not known if the reason for their execution was their participation in the armored car production scheme or other actions undertaken in French resistance. Despite Restany and his men's efforts, some of the hidden material was found by German forces. On 12 December 1942, most likely following a denunciation, the exact position of the crates containing the weapons for the armored cars were found, and the crates were dug back out of the soil. Restany suspected an Alsatian worker named Beck for this denunciation, as he had allegedly been seen with German troops following the occupation of the Free Zone, despite having allegedly been enrolled in the Wehrmacht. A truck driver reported the location of the sous workshop to German forces and was condemned to 10 years in prison at the end of the war. As a result of the denunciations, and to avoid the owners of the terrains being at risk, the locations of the Grifoul quarry, where the turrets were stored, as well as the Vitrac workshops, were leaked to the Germans. Still, some elements, notably a number of armor plates, appear to have remained unfound by the Germans. Most importantly, Restany conserved the plans and shared them in his 1948 book. The large armored car manufacturing scheme undertaken by Émile Mollard's CDM under Joseph Restany's lead is a particularly little known and celebrated but interesting part of the French resistance. In high secrecy, the workers and engineers operating under the lead of Restany managed not only to produce and rearm 45 Panhard 178 CDMs, but to build an entire armored car from the chassis up, while remaining away from the eyes of Vichy's higher-ups and the German Armistice Commission until the occupation of southern France. One could definitely argue that the CDM armored car appears to be a primitive design. It was, without a single doubt, not up to the comparison with any medium or large-sized armored car of the late war, such as the German SDKFZ 234-2 or a British AEC or even Daimler armored car in terms of capacities. Even some of the more advanced pre-1940 designs, such as the Panhard 178, outclassed it. Nonetheless, the scale of the underground manufacturing scheme undertaken by the CDM remains impressive when taking into account the context of its undertaking. Sadly for the CDM, the whole project had to be urgently dismantled to avoid German capture in November of 1942, and would never bear the fruits of the work, time, and materials invested into it. Nowadays, this aspect of the French resistance remains very lightly touched on and known by the general public and even many enthusiasts. Despite Mollard being sent to a concentration camp, he survived, but his son, also involved in the CDM, did not. Mollard remains a little-known figure, far overshadowed by military commanders of Free France that earned a reputation in the field, such as Leclerc, Juin, or Delattre. That's all for this video. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. we'll be releasing new videos on the regular. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Reddit. If you use Discord, there's a link to our community server in the description. And if you would like to help us continue to develop and expand, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to help us enhance and design new articles and features for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.